Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're so excited to be able to host this webinar on the topic of the Nisei Soldier legacy and why it matters today. My name is Erin, and I am the Vice President of the Florida JET Alumni Association, a nonprofit organization in Florida, which aims to connect JET program, Japan Exchange and Teaching Program alumni, and our local communities with Japan. Tonight's discussion will center on the important history and legacy of the Japanese American Nisei soldiers of the 100th Infantry Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team, both of whom overcame poverty and prejudice during World War II. Despite these hardships, the 100th Infantry Battalion, 442nd Regimental Combat Team continues to be the most highly decorated US military unit for its size and period of combat service during World War II. While much of the history of the Nisei soldiers and veterans is centered around Hawaii, we also want to examine our local Florida ties to Japan and this legacy. By bringing both the experiences of Hawaii, Nisei soldiers and veterans, and Japanese Americans living in Florida, we hope to have an interesting conversation on why this topic is important for us to be speaking about today, and also what we can learn from examining the history of these important soldiers and veterans. So next I want to introduce our very lovely and important co-organizational sponsors, US JETAA and Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. First, I'll introduce Ms. Bahia Simmons-Lane from US JETAA.
Okay, am I spotlighted? I can't tell. All right, anyway, thank you all so much for being here today. Really happy that you're all here. We are very excited to be supporting such an important webinar as part of Florida JETAA's series on this topic. For those of you who are not familiar with US JETAA, the US JET Program Alumni Association, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in Washington, DC, that furthers US-Japan relations by supporting the national network of JET alumni, and that includes individual alumni as well as the JETAA chapters. This program is being funded through our chapter grant program in partnership with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. And the goal of this program is to support regional chapters in bringing US-Japan related issues to their local community. So I know we're gonna have a great discussion today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of the panelists.
All right, and next I would like to introduce Ms. Shanti Shoji from Sasakawa Peace Foundation for her remarks, and you're spotlighted currently, Shanti.
All right, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Shanti Shoji, and I'm the Director of Programs at Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. We're based in Washington, DC, and today I also have Ms. Isabel Burke, who is Program Assistant at Sasakawa USA and is working on this program. I'm very happy to be here alongside US JETAA and the JET Alumni Association of Florida for this wonderful webinar on the legacy of the Japanese American Nisei soldiers who honorably served during the Second World War. For those in the audience who may not be familiar with Sasakawa USA, I'll just briefly introduce us. So we're a nonpartisan 501c3 organization, and we're dedicated to deepening the understanding of and strengthening the relationship between the United States and Japan for the benefit of a free and open international community. Our activities mainly focus on security and diplomacy, but as you can see today and this evening, we also are dedicated to supporting grassroots programs which strengthen cross-cultural understanding between the United States and Japan. And we're especially proud that we can support events such as this one through our chapter grant program with US JETAA. Finally, I'd like to thank the leadership team at JETAA Florida, as well as Bahia at US JETAA for all of your hard work to put together these really impactful sessions so that we can have more people learn about the U.S.-Japan alliance in various aspects. So thank you so much.
Thank you both again to US JETAA and Sasakawa USA. Quite literally, we could not have done it without you, and we're so thankful for your support for this webinar. So to begin our conversation, I want to first introduce our speakers for tonight. First up, we have Dr. Lynn Heirakuji, who is the president and a board member of the Nisei Veterans Legacy, a Honolulu nonprofit organization dedicated to the preservation and sharing of the legacy of the Nisei soldiers of World War II. Lynn had a 30-year career with the federal government in Washington, D.C. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Personnel Oversight for the U.S. Army. She acted for, advised, and assisted the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs in development, implementation, and review of military and civilian personnel and compensation policy, diversity matters, health affairs, soldier and family well-being, language and culture programs, and casualty and memorial affairs. Prior to joining the Army team, Lynn was a member of the Senior Executive Service, serving as the Deputy Director of the Office of Human Capital Management for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Lynn also served in senior staff and leadership positions at the U.S. Departments of Homeland Security, Housing and Urban Development, and Commerce. Lynn holds a doctorate degree from Howard University, a master's degree from the University of Denver, and a bachelor's of arts degree from the University of Hawaii. After retiring from the Army, Lynn returned to Hawaii, where she worked for the Lieutenant Governor and the Governor of the state. She later served as the Associate Director for Administration for the University of Hawaii Cancer Center. Lynn serves on the board of the Manalani Nursing and Rehabilitation Center and is an honorary board member of the Pan-Pacific American Leaders and Mentors. She is a council leader with the U.S.-Japan Council and a member of the Sons and Daughters of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Lynn actively supports Nisei veteran issues and has spoken at various venues about the Nisei Soldier story. We're very honored to have you with us here today, Lynn. Thank you so much. Next, I want to introduce Ms. Diane Carter from the Morikami Museum and Japanese Gardens in Delray Beach, Florida. Ms. Carter has utilized her art and communication degree to offer increased awareness and inspire through such groups as the Wild's Endangered Species Concern with the Columbus Zoo in Columbus, Ohio, Artists Alley in Delray Beach, Florida, Working Artists, the Public Arts Advisory Board in the City of Delray Beach, the Board of Governors for the Delray Beach Playhouse. Besides speaking engagements, Diane worked full-time for the Morikami Museum and Japanese Gardens in membership, guest relations, and the development department for 5 years. Now as collections assistant for the curatorial department for 2 years, her duties include the knowledge and preservation of collections artwork and artifacts, and the maintaining of the database and hard files while assisting with staff, the staff with exhibits, openings, websites, and marketing. Diane is also pleased to represent her Japanese American roots through her work with the Morikami Museum and Japanese Gardens. Thank you as well, Diane, for joining us today. Can't wait to hear your perspective on the Florida connection with Japan. And lastly, we have Dr. Mitzi Uehara Carter, who is a assistant teaching professor of anthropology and East Asian studies, and is the director of Global Indigenous Forum at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. She served as a fellow with the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science in Okinawa, Japan from 2011 to 2012 at the University of the Ryukyus. She researches ethnographic methodology of militarization in Okinawa and transnational understanding of Blackness and race in Japan. She is working on her first book, which will trace her mother's journey from war-torn Okinawa to a racially segregated US South as a lens for capturing Black Okinawan life and afterlives in the Black Pacific. Dr. Carter received her BA in Cultural Anthropology from Duke University and her master's and PhD degrees in anthropology from UC Berkeley. And again, we're so pleased to have such illustrious panelists speaking with us today. So first, I would like to invite Dr. Lynn Heirakuji for her remarks on the Nisei Soldier's legacy. And give me 1 second as I get everything set up. All right. Okay, Lynn, you should be all good to go.
Ready to go. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for your interest in this topic. And thank you for the JET program and to the Sasakawa Foundation for your support as well. What I'm going to do over the next 20 minutes is basically give you a very brief overview of the Nisei Soldier story. But before I do, I want to define what the term Nisei means. Nisei is a Japanese word and it refers to the second generation Japanese to be in this country. So the Issei were the first generation to come to Hawaii. They were the original immigrants. They had children. The children were the Nisei. And when the Nisei had children, they gave birth to the Sansei. So I am a Sansei, Japanese American to be in this country. The story I'm going to tell you about is primarily from the perspective of Hawaii. And I think what you will see as I go through the presentation is that the Nisei Soldier story has some very strong Hawaii roots. When people think about the Nisei Soldier story, I think most of them think about the 442nd and the 100th, but there were actually other units that served in the military during World War II, not to mention the many Japanese women who also served in the Army Nurse Corps and the Women's Army Corps. Volumes have been written and can be written about each of these units, but in the short time I can only give you the broadest perspective on each one. So let's go ahead and start. Next slide, please. The Congressional Medal of Honor is the highest military award given for individual valor. And up until the year 2000, keeping in mind that World War II ended in Europe in 1945, there was only one Medal of Honor that had been given to a Japanese American Nisei soldier of World War II, despite their extraordinary fighting record. In 1995, Senator Okaka from Hawaii sponsored legislation that required a review of Asian American and Pacific Islanders who had been given lesser awards for possible upgrade. As a result of that review, 20 additional Medals of Honor were awarded to World War II Nisei soldiers. And this is a photo on the right of Senator Inouye, who was a member of the 442nd, being given his Medal of Honor by President Clinton in June of the year 2000. And I'm not going to read the quote to you, you can read it, but hopefully at the end of this presentation, this quote will have some meaning for you. Next slide, please. Before I start talking about the various military units, I'd like to give you a very brief history of the Japanese immigration to the United States. The Japanese began immigrating to the territory of Hawaii to work in the sugar and the pineapple plantations in about the late 1800s. The majority of those who came were very poor, and they came seeking a better life. Next slide. They found the working and living conditions to be very, very hard, but most found Hawaii to be a pretty good place to live. And so most decided to stay and make Hawaii their home after their contract periods ended. So by the year 1900, there were over 100,000 Japanese living in the territory of Hawaii. They worked alongside many other ethnic groups of Filipinos, Portuguese, Chinese, Hawaiians, who were also working on the plantation. So it was a very multicultural society in Hawaii at that time and continuing today. Next slide, please. Soon children, the Nisei, were born, and these were the second generation Japanese Americans to be in this country. So the Nisei were taught Japanese customs, but they were really raised as Americans. But the Japanese, like many of the other ethnic groups, were really treated as second-class citizens in Hawaii, as you will see. Next slide, please. Life changed for everyone on December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack on Oahu released all restraints on anti-Japanese sentiment that had been brewing in this country for years. The Japanese became the targets of racial hysteria, of discrimination, and of prejudice. I remember my mother's family, my mother was Japanese, telling us that when war broke out, her family gathered things in their home that were Japanese, books, photographs, clothing. They gathered them and they burned them. They got rid of them because they were so afraid of what was going to happen to them now that we were at war with Japan. Next slide, please. 110,000 Japanese, 2/3 of whom were American citizens living on the West Coast and some in Hawaii, were placed in 10 incarceration camps located in desolate areas in the country. No charges were ever filed against them. There was no due process given. These individuals were rounded up en masse simply because they looked like the enemy. Families were given a few days to collect their belongings, a few days to get rid of their possessions. They lost homes, they lost businesses, but most of all, they lost their freedom and their dignity. Next slide. The situation in Hawaii was a bit different. The Japanese at the time comprised about 40% of the population in Hawaii. So to incarcerate that many people was simply impractical. In addition, the Japanese comprised a significant part of the labor force in Hawaii, so it would have been economically devastating to incarcerate that many. But what was also happening, which I think was unique to Hawaii, was that there were many local leaders, folks like Robert Shivers, who was the head of the Honolulu FBI office, folks like Hung Wai-ching, a prominent Chinese community leader who spoke out very strongly in support of the Japanese at great risks to their own reputations, and really spoke out against incarceration of the Japanese in Hawaii en masse. Nevertheless, about 2,000 Japanese were eventually incarcerated in Hawaii at places like Honouliuli internment camp shown here. This was the largest camp that existed in Hawaii. It was the longest serving camp as well. So those who were incarcerated in Hawaii were primarily prominent leaders such as priests, counselor agents, businessmen, people who might have connections to Japan. I will add that none of the Japanese American internees were ever found guilty of espionage, of sabotage, or any overt acts against the United States. Next slide, please. As I said at the outset, when people think about the Nisei Soldier story, I think most people think about the 442nd. But there were actually 4 separate military units of Nisei who served during World War II. When war broke out, the US government pretty immediately declared Japanese Americans to be ineligible aliens or enemy aliens, ineligible to serve in the US military. However, 1,400 Nisei had already been drafted into the Hawaii National Guard. And when war broke out, these men were actually called up to defend posts in Hawaii. But the government quickly grew suspicious of them and held them in limbo at Schofield Barracks on the island of Oahu for several months. And then in June of 1942, these 1,400 Nisei, who were part of the National Guard, were secretly shipped to San Francisco. And when they landed in San Francisco, they were told, you are now the 100th Infantry Battalion, paren separate. Separate meaning that they were not attached to any other Army unit. They were then sent on to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin for training. So the 100th originated in Hawaii. Next slide, please. While this was going on, there were 169 Nisei ROTC cadets at the University of Hawaii. And they were very upset at being labeled enemy aliens and being told that they were ineligible to serve. And so they petitioned the government for the opportunity to serve their country. And in February of 1942, the government finally relented, and they were allowed to serve as volunteers during construction work for the Army. And they called themselves the Varsity Victory Volunteers. Many of these men would go on to volunteer for the 442nd when it was activated a year later. Okay, next slide, please. So we'll fast forward a year. It is now February of 1943. The government was so impressed by the work of the Varsity Victory Volunteers and the training record of the 100th at Camp McCoy that it decided to activate the all-volunteer Japanese American fighting unit called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The call went out for 4,500 men to volunteer. The government asked for 3,000 from the mainland and 1,500 from Hawaii. Well, over 10,000 from Hawaii stepped forward to serve, and my dad was one of them. And he told us later that many of his friends wept. They wept when they were rejected from serving because they wanted to serve. They wanted to serve so badly. And this is a very iconic photo of the 442nd standing in front of what's called Iolani Palace in Honolulu. And this photo was taken on the eve of their departure to go to Camp Shelby, Mississippi for training. And I so wish to this day that when my dad was living, I asked him, where are you in this photo? But you know, it's far too late for me to do so. So 2/3 of the original 442nd came from Hawaii. Next slide, please. So the 442nd Japanese American soldiers, the Nisei soldiers from Hawaii, were joined by Japanese American Nisei soldiers from the mainland who had volunteered to serve from incarceration camps. And at the beginning, these two groups of soldiers fought a lot because they had very different life experiences. And the situation became so difficult at one point that the government began to wonder if this move to form this all-volunteer Japanese unit would work, because there was so much fighting going on. My father told me about that as well. But my father also told me that one day he and a fellow soldier decided to take a visit to Camp Rower in Arkansas. And they had really no idea what this camp was about. They thought they were going to socialize. But as he and his fellow soldier approached Camp Rower, they began to see the barbed wire, and they began to see the armed guards, and they suddenly realized what this camp really was. Nevertheless, they went into the camp. They got to know some of the people living there. They got to meet some of the families. And my father told us that after that visit to Camp Rower, he had much more sympathy for his fellow soldiers from the mainland and more respect. And he was able to get along with them a whole lot better. So these two groups finally trained together at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and they eventually learned to fight as one. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, the 100th completed its training and arrived in Italy to begin fighting in September of 1943, about 1,300 men. The 100th later became nicknamed the Purple Heart Battalion due to its extraordinarily high number of casualties. The Purple Heart is given to those who are wounded or killed as a result of enemy action. Their magnificent battlefield record helped to pave the way for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Next slide, please. In June of 1944, 9 months after the 100th began fighting, the 442nd landed in Italy to begin fighting. And the 100th Infantry Battalion became the first battalion of the 442nd, but it was allowed to keep its unit name because of its extraordinary fighting record. So from Italy, the 100th 442nd went on to France, where it helped to liberate small towns such as Brogue, shown in this photograph. Next slide, please. probably one, if not the most famous battle fought by the 100th 442nd was the rescue of the lost battalion. And let me set the picture for you. It was the winter of 1944 in the Vosges Mountains in France. 2 prior attempts by the Army to rescue about 200 Texas soldiers had failed. These soldiers were stuck in the Vosges Mountains surrounded by the German Army. The 100th 442nd was ordered to go in and rescue these Texas soldiers. Mind you, the Nisei soldiers had been in combat for some time. Many were tired, they were sick, they were cold, some of them had frostbite. But nevertheless, after 5 days of brutal combat, they were able to rescue these Texas soldiers. But the price of that victory was very high. Over 400 were killed or wounded to save the 200 Texas soldiers. So in essence, they lost more men than they actually saved. And until this day, the French annually commemorates this battle as representing their final liberation from German occupation. Next slide, please. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion was a unit of the 442nd and the only Nisei unit to fight in Germany. In the spring of 1945, shortly before the war in Europe ended, the men of the 522nd helped to liberate hundreds of prisoners from a Dachau subcamp and from the Dachau death march. And the irony here is that you had many Nisei soldiers who were helping to liberate prisoners from a concentration camp, while many of them had families who were being held in internment camps on American soil. Next slide, please. So the 100th 442nd together fought in 8 major military campaigns in Italy, in France, and in Germany. Next slide. The war in Europe ended in the spring of 1945, and reports of their sacrifice and their heroism began to make their way back to this country. And it helped to change in a positive way the country's perception of Japanese Americans. The 442nd left Europe in 1946 and stopped in Washington, D.C. on their way back to receive President Truman's welcome home and award. And it was during that time that Truman said to them, "You have fought not only the enemy, but you have fought prejudice at home and you have won." And 2 years later, he ordered the end to racial segregation in the US military. Next slide, please. So the 100th 442nd remains until today the most decorated military unit in US history for its size and length of combat service during World War II. For example, together they received 7 presidential unit citations. The PUC is the highest award the military can give for an entire unit, and this is unprecedented. Over 4,000 Purple Hearts were also awarded to the men of the 100th 442nd. Next slide, please. So we have the 100th and we have the 442nd, and we also have the Military Intelligence Service. Japanese Americans with good Japanese language skills were sent to the Military Intelligence Service. About 6,000 men, about half from Hawaii, served as interpreters, as translators, as cave fleshers, intelligence specialists, in addition to being infantrymen in the Pacific War. As you can imagine, this is very dangerous work because they could very easily be mistaken for the enemy. Next slide. Next slide, please. The MIS soldiers translated at all surrender ceremonies across the Pacific, and the MIS are credited with shortening the Pacific War and saving countless Japanese and American lives. They were sometimes called the secret weapon of the Pacific War because Japan did not know that we had soldiers who could understand the Japanese dialect. Next slide, please. So after the war, many of the MIS soldiers continued to work in Tokyo as translators and government liaisons, helping to reconstruct Japan, helping to heal the wounds of war. But their story could not be told until many, many years later because the military intelligence documents that created them remain classified. The PUC, Presidential Unit Citation, was also given to the MIS in 2000 belatedly for the entire period of their service during World War II. Again, very unprecedented. Next slide, please. There was also a fourth unit of Nisei soldiers who participated in World War II. This was a 1399 Engineer Construction Battalion. It was a unit of about 1,000 Nisei soldiers who stayed in Hawaii and built infrastructure and training facilities for the Army and the Marines. They completed over 54 major defense projects. And many of the men who served in the 1399 were very quiet, were very humble about what they did because they did not go into combat, but nevertheless, they made an important wartime contribution. So I always want to make sure that I mention them, as well as the Nisei women who served in the Women's Army Corps and the Army Nurse Corps. Next slide, please. So the Nisei soldier story is actually at least two stories. One, what they did during the war, and secondly, what they did after the war. After the war, many returned to Hawaii and said, "We have shed our blood on the battlefield, and we have proven our loyalty beyond all doubt. And we are no longer interested in going back to plantation life, and we're no longer willing to be treated as second-class citizens." So many of them used the GI Bill to get an education, and they went into business, they went into politics, and they were instrumental in transforming the social, political, and economic landscape in Hawaii in the 50s and the 60s, along with many others, not working by themselves. They lobbied for statehood for Hawaii, which came in 1959. Their decorated service was one of the factors that persuaded President Eisenhower and the Congress to endorse statehood for Hawaii. Next slide, please. Many entered local and national politics. On the far left is Senator Spark Matsunaga. He was a member of the 100th Infantry Battalion. On the far right is Senator Inoue. I think at the time he was a congressman. He was a member of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a disabled veteran. And here they stand with President Johnson and Governor Burns of Hawaii. And I also want to point out Patsy Mink, the woman in the photo. She was a Nisei woman and the first woman of color to serve in the US House of Representatives. So again, working with many, many other groups here in Hawaii, they helped to bring about a more equitable society in the territory and in the state. Next slide, please. The veterans, in particular, Senator Matsunaga, shown at the far left, provided key support for the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provided a presidential apology and reparations to those who had been incarcerated during World War II. The legislation was called H.R. 442 to remind Congress of the sacrifices of the 442nd. And then in 2010, the Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest medal awarded by Congress, to the men of the 100th, the 442nd, and the MIS. Next slide, please. So after the war, as you can well imagine, Japanese customs were very unpopular. When the Nisei veterans returned to Hawaii, they came back and they said, you know, we're proud of our heritage. And so they helped to bring back customs to Hawaii, customs like Japanese dance, like sumo, like taiko drumming, shown here in this photograph. Many of the veterans also worked very hard to open up business opportunities for the other veterans and for everyone. For example, Sakai Takahashi, member of the 100th, a decorated veteran of the 100th Infantry Battalion, when he returned to Hawaii after the war, what he found was that he couldn't even find a bank to loan him money to buy a suit. So he, working with many other Nisei veterans and with the Issei, the first generation, helped to found Central Pacific Bank, a very strong institution that continues to exist today in Hawaii. And this allowed many of the Nisei veterans and others to get loans, to start businesses, and to buy homes. So arguably, the post-war accomplishments of the Nisei soldiers, what they did to radically change Hawaii into a more open into a more democratic society may have been their longer lasting legacy. They opened the doors for everyone, and I, as a descendant, am a direct beneficiary of what they did. Next slide, please. So I'd like to end this presentation with a reference to the Gopher Brogue Soldiers commemorative stamp that was just issued in June of 2021, just last year. It's the first stamp to feature an Asian American soldier. The image of the stamp shown at the far left was based on a photo of an actual Nisei soldier shown in the middle. And that Nisei soldier was a gentleman named Shiroku Yamamoto, who was from Hawaii. And Shiroku is the gentleman on the left in the last photograph on the right. And the approval of the stamp was the culmination of a long 15-year journey that was started by 3 Nisei women in California, all of whom endured life in incarceration camps, and 2 of whom were married to Nisei soldiers. So I'm going to close here by saying that the Nisei men and women who served our country during World War II did so quietly and did so humbly, but they also did so amidst an atmosphere of pervasive discrimination and hostility toward Japanese Americans. Their service on and off the battlefield helped to change the country's view of Japanese Americans. It helped to level the playing field in Hawaii, and it helped to open the doors of opportunity wider for everyone. So the Nisei took a stand against discrimination some 80 years ago, and I can't help but believe that they would not want us, the descendants, to continue that battle today. And so I hope that the stamp can be a timely reminder for all of us that in this time of deep divisions in our country and a rise in anti-Asian hate incidents, hopeful that the stamp can be a reminder that we should not forget the lessons of history, and that we should continue to be vigilant in ensuring equity for everyone. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lynn. What a wonderful presentation. So now we're going to open up to some commentary from Ms. Diane Carter from the Morikami Museum. And Diane, let me just get you spotlighted. And let me get your PowerPoint shared. Okay.
Very good.
All right, Diane, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Good to have you here this evening. When thinking about the Nisei Soldier legacy, or just the Nisei legacy, I'm reminded that in 2021, there were only 2.7% of the population in Florida as Asian Americans, not just Japanese Americans, but Asian Americans. So it's a very small percentage that are here that are speaking. So I think it's amazing to know our quiet legacy started with the Yamato colony here in 1904, over 100 years ago, and with Joe Sakai from Miyazu, Japan, graduating with a business degree from New York University and looking for business opportunities with his newfound education and his newfound country. Next slide, please. Thank you. I work in the curatorial staff for the Morikami Museum and Japanese Gardens. It's 16 of 200 acres that George Morikami, who was a Yamato colonist, donated to Palm Beach County. He has been quoted as saying he wanted to thank the United States for all that it offered him and for it becoming his home. Next slide, please. Mr. Morikami, he came in 1905, and even with the loss of assets, some crop failures, and World War II, he became a millionaire. I have to mention that he didn't have a spouse or children. I always have to say that. Though many of the colonists were educated and knew Japanese, English, and some Spanish, Mr. Morikami had to go to an American 5th grade class to be able to learn English. He was one of the few who did not come from a former samurai or entrepreneurial family. Many of the other Japanese men with higher education were hoping to become landowners and businessmen, and that's what he became. Next slide, please. When it was in full swing, the Yamato colony had 25 to 30 people. That included families, wives, and children that had an official postmark. As you can see, they had their own railroad depot, a grocery store, and a gas station. Yamato, an old name for Japan, was one of only the few reminders of where they came from. The colonists wanted to be Americans. They wanted to dress, eat, and recreate like their neighbors. Next slide, please. This is the Kamiya home. You can see, though, that some did incorporate some of the Japanese background, and this is a koi pond. You can see the chickens to the right that are by the stone lantern. For those of you that have been to or live near Boca Raton and Delray Beach, that white strip in the middle of the photo of sand is Dixie Highway. And this was taken in 1925. So by 1920s, approximately 6 or 7 people left only because there was a land boom in Florida, and many of them sold out and moved on. Mr. Morikami actually had moved northeast to Delray, and then World War II broke out. Next slide, please. At that time, there were approximately about 150 Japanese living in Florida. So again, we weren't overrun. We didn't have a lot of people that were interested in what the Japanese Americans were doing here. But Floridians' Japanese heritage were moved individually sometimes if they were shown that they were doing some fifth column activities. Sometimes they were moved to internment camps. And 3 families from the Yamato colony unfortunately ended up in internment camps because they had moved to California or Chicago, Illinois. Those colonists who still owned acreage at the Yamato were poorly compensated for their land and removed. And it became the Boca Raton airfield, which, by the way, was teaching the secret new technology of radar, and now it's become the Florida Atlantic University. So somehow education did take over in the area, even though it was taken in a different way. And I have to mention also that it wasn't just Japanese people's land, but also Germans and Bahamians lived on this land, and they were also asked to leave. Those that were still living here, Mr. Morikami and the Kobayashi family, were required by the government to have 2 servicemen in their homes. And they had to feed them and take care of them while they were in the home. And this was during a time when their assets had been frozen, and a lot of them didn't have a lot of business because people would not do business with Japanese. So it was a hard time, and yet they were willing to take care of these people that were in their home. And there were a few quotes that I thought were very kind that thanked them for doing such a nice job, and they appreciated it. Next slide, please. This is Tom Kobayashi. He was actually in the home during World War II. He's in uniform here because he then joined the Army of Occupation. But when he was at home and the servicemen were staying there with him, he remembers a German-American serviceman whose father was living in New York City. And he asked Tom, "Why am I watching your father like this? No one is keeping an eye on my father in New York." And this kind of struck me, that reminded me that my family, my paternal family, the Hirabayashis, were farmers in Washington State, and they were put into the Tule Lake internment camp. And at the same time, my German grandmother on the maternal side, whose brother-in-law was a speaker for Hitler, was visiting her nephew who was in a POW camp for Nazi leaders in Maine. And I had to stop and ask myself, wow, that I never even considered the difference in that during World War II, but it happened. And then I read that during World War II, German U-boats sank 24 ships off both the ocean and Gulf coasts of Florida. So it sounded like the Germans were a little more invasive, but what was the difference? And I had to really think about that. because this is family on both sides. Perhaps it was physical features. Perhaps it was the media and the government. I'm not sure. The reaction to something that may seem or look different. What could we learn through this? That's what I asked myself. Next slide, please. Learning was the operative word. At the Morikami, our mission statement of to engage a diverse audience by presenting Japanese cultural experiences that educate and inspire, in my opinion, influenced many folks that came to the museum to appreciate and enjoy the Japanese culture, as other cultures could do also. It's the education of people that might be able to help us make our way through all this. All of this stemming from a man who came to the US for an education and a man who found a home learning about and working the land. Next slide, please. Actually, not all my Hirabayashi family was interned during the war. My uncle Gordon stood quietly and steadfast for his rights. He purposefully broke curfew and went to federal prison in order to take his case to the US Supreme Court. His quote here, "I never look at my case as just my own or just as a Japanese American case. It is an American case with principles that affect the fundamental human rights of all Americans." This is a great reminder to me to remember what happened during World War II, the 442nd, the camps, the protesters, and how diverse Americans responded. Gordon Hirabayashi and his 4 siblings all went into forms of teaching as adults. Again, the education. I want to thank the JET program and Sasakawa Foundation for bridging cultures through education. I think this is going to be so important. Perhaps with the education and understanding, there can be less ignorance and less violence. Thanks so much for your ears.
Thank you, Diane. A wonderful commentary on the Florida perspective of this time period as well. So let me now turn it over to Dr. Carter at FIU. I'm going to put you on spotlight now, Mitzi, and I'm going to, you have screen share ability, so you should be able to present yours. Let me know if you.
Okay. Can you see that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. Good evening, everyone. You know, as I listen to these stories, I'm reminded of a couple of points that I want to focus on in these 10 minutes that I have. I'm reminded that these stories aren't in a vacuum, right? That the contributions of Nisei, and there's so many that were discussed here tonight, are rendered largely invisible. I have so many students come to my Asian studies courses, and they are sometimes more so than shocked that they don't know this much. They're sometimes upset that they haven't been given this information at an earlier stage in their history, in their educational history. And so I think a lot of these contributions are rendered largely invisible because of the legacy of racism, and we have to discuss that head on. And I'm reminded that change requires intense vigilance and courage to continue telling these stories over and over again. So thank you, Dr. Hirakuji and Diane, for telling these stories, and to the Sasakawa Foundation and to JETAA and JETAA of Florida for providing the platform to give these stories some air. The contributions of Japanese Americans in their quest for broader civil rights in this country, and those of many other marginalized and racialized peoples for that matter, especially in regards to the contributions to the military, are not commonly discussed, nor are the reasons they are deliberately obscured in history itself. In a lot of my research, I've studied how in the U.S. military, service in the military is often deemed as a kind of a fast track to showcase your loyalty, as Lynn discussed here tonight. And you're symbolically deemed as kind of a super citizen of sorts, right? But history has taught us that this symbolism is not always evenly perceived when we're talking about some of the more marginalized and vulnerable people in the United States. For example, we know that countless number of Black soldiers returning from World War I and from World War II, who were very, entered public spaces very visibly in their military uniforms, were specifically targeted violently and in many cases lynched by white supremacists who wanted to ensure that these Black vets were kept in their place and directly challenge these Black veterans' efforts to assert equality and justice after putting their lives on the line. These kinds of stories are inextricably linked to the Nisei Soldier stories told here. They're linked by the way power is authorized and how consent is billed, who gets to create history textbooks, who gets to add them to our curriculum, who deems them meaningful enough to be included in the story of how this country was shaped. So when we raise Nisei Soldier stories, we also have to be mindful of the intersectional histories so we can target the root causes for their invisibility in the first place. I'm gonna just kind of run through a few slides very briefly to kind of give a quick rundown on how some of these stereotypes about Asians have been sedimented and impact the ways we can even receive these stories about Nisei. So a lot of these stereotypes about Asians didn't just materialize on their own out of the blue, right? In the 13th century or so, some Europeans began to travel across the Silk Road networks, and most Europeans didn't really, they never traveled to these places. So they were learning about this new space that becomes known as the Orient from people who had traveled there. And if you read some of these accounts, there's some far out stories. And so the depiction of Asia was one that the depictions of kind of a strange and exotic land. And this imaginary, that starts to cement of this place called the East becomes juxtaposed against something that's firming up that eventually comes to be known as the Occident or the West. And for many Europeans, the Occident was defined as the norm, the standard, the kind of fixed point around which the rest of the world supposedly orbits. And the fact that the term Orient can have any coherence at all is because of its imaginary character. So the actual peoples inhabiting the worlds between Turkey and Japan is really diverse in every respect, right? But nonetheless, stereotypes start to form about this very diverse place onto which Europeans often projected their own cultural anxieties and fantasies and other imaginings. So this is obviously, I put this up here, this is a very old ad, obviously, but you can see how the idea of an inscrutable Asia starts to get used, especially in tourist languages, right? As this unchanging kind of static place. And these kinds of imaginaries morph over time and build on top of each other. They get sedimented, right? So in the 1700s, for example, Linnaeus, he started to build these ideas of taxonomy, human taxonomy, which were highly influential to other thinkers. And he built on this legacy, this earlier legacy of thinking about this Orient as a strange place. So he took these kind of physical and cultural aspects of all of these different groups that he was categorizing, putting into little boxes, but also building social hierarchies around them in this pseudoscience. So you can see here, look at this language here. We see this used during times of war, right? We saw this during World War II, a lot of the same kind of language from the 1700s. So we have to remember these things don't go away on their own, right? We have to target them and look at the history of how they came to be, how they come to be implemented, how they're sedimented and then recycled, right? It gets recirculated in new forms, right? It gets recirculated into anti-immigration legislation. 1876, you can see this language being used in a congressional testimony, right? So you have these very strong ideas about incomplete loyalty, right? That's very clear here. And these are words that have real material consequences. And we see this when people get whipped up into a frenzy, into racial frenzies. We see this right now, right, with the coronavirus and how people can use this kind of language. It could lead, as we saw in the 1800s, to massacres and lynching of Chinese people, of towns that were razed, right, across the west coast of the United States. We saw it in World War I and we see it in World War II, right? So these perceptions have a staying power across multiple generations, and they're sometimes even painfully internalized, but they're often revived by some politicians who might often use this kind of language as a dog whistle, right? And it ricochets into ears of people who are looking for a way to pin their fears onto others, right? So when we allow myths of Japanese people in particular to continue, we perpetuate them without challenging them, that's very dangerous. I'm gonna skip this slide because of time, we can come back to that later. I'm gonna just quickly throw this slide up because I was reading this book about this new book that just came out by Moon Ho-jung. And I was reading his blog post the other day, and this quote really struck me deeply, and it made me think about this panel tonight. He says, although I understand the impulse to proclaim our Americanness, to condemn hate crimes and to demand progressive reforms, we cannot stop there. Perhaps we shouldn't even start there. The uncritical insistence on the Americanness of Asian Americans can never meaningfully address that deeper history of empire and white supremacy. Until we can make sense of that history, we will not be able to understand why anti-Asian racism remains such a violent force menacing the world we live in today, right? That was really powerful. We have to make sense of the history of racism, and or it'll just continue to repeat. And we've seen this over and over. More of the exclusions of Nisei legacies from our history, more of the possible roundup of racialized peoples or targeting them with fear tactics. These things can be on repeat unless we stop and look at, again, the root causes of where these things hail from. I'll just end briefly and end by saying that we have to stand firm against all the bullying we see today from those who we shirk from the painful education about racism. We should continue to really embrace the discomfort of our past to progress and to improve. That shouldn't be something that we shy away from, right? If we run from the tough stories, we're going to fall victim to them over and over again. And we will see the same tactics of anti-Asian violence and invisibility being repeated from all the way from the 1800s, right? Refashioned and slightly upgraded rhetoric. So I'm gonna encourage you, I'll end with encouraging you all to watch a couple of documentaries. This one is pretty newish, came out, I think just before the pandemic or right during the pandemic. It's Asian Americans from PBS. You can rent it from Amazon Prime, I believe. It might be floating online somewhere else, but especially episode 2, which is specifically on Japanese Americans and touches on some of the things that were discussed here tonight. It's a really fantastic documentary. And then this episode of the episode 3 of Race, the Power of an Illusion. And I found this Vimeo link, I think it's here. And you can Google it and find it online. Or if you're associated with the university, you can also, usually find this in your library. But it's so well done because it really looks at court cases and how Japanese Americans use the court system, as Diane was talking about, to try to really kind of fight back against discrimination and to make sure that the legacy of Japanese Americans was really more integrated into American history and to really change the lives, the trajectory of what had happened to them for so many years. And then there's also another really fantastic PBS, very short 6-minute description about why we use the word Asian. It kind of goes into the whole history of what I was briefly running through earlier about the history of the word Orientalism and Oriental. But it does, you can connect the dots and you'll see how this is also very much linked with what both of Diane and Lynn were talking about here tonight. And there's so many good resources right now on solidarity and how to be a good ally, how to improve education, looking at solidarity from different perspectives. This, including this one, you can find online on YouTube. It's a really good one I watched last summer. But yeah, I just end with this quote, which I love. We all should really kind of, to make change, lasting change, we should really, again, embrace discomfort and be a part of a solidarity that costs something. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitzi. And yes, a very important conversation. I'm very happy to be having it with everyone here this evening. So now, of course, we've had so much information thrown at us. And so much great information. Of course, we're running a little behind time, but I want to open it up now to a moderated discussion, and I'm going to spotlight myself and Mitzi and Lynn. If I can do that. Let's see. Add spotlight and Diane. Add spotlight. Okay, great. So now we're going to get into a moderated discussion. I'm probably only going to ask 1 or 2 questions since we are running short on time, and I do want to make sure we can answer some questions in the chat. So I think that all 3 of you touched on something on different aspects, but it comes together so beautifully, especially in conversation with what we've been seeing today, which is unfortunately a rise in Asian American discrimination, in large part due to the pandemic and some reactions to that. And I loved how you put it, Mitzi, this kind of idea of the myth of Asianness or Easternness. And I want to kind of contrast that with the concept of identity that many, that Nisei and Sansei and Japanese Americans have, and just Asian Americans in general as well. So, we talked about the fight for statehood in Hawaii that many Nisei and Sansei were involved in. And I want to, and George Morikami as well, with his work in kind of developing a Japanese connection in Florida. So where else can we see political and cultural input made by Nisei, Sansei, or just Japanese Americans in US society today? I'll mute myself. And Diane, if you're unmuted, I'll go. If you unmute yourself, I'll introduce you to speak.
Okay, I believe I'm unmuted.
You are, yes.
I'm sorry, are you asking about Florida, or are you asking about
it could be, I would love to hear the Florida perspective, because I don't think many of us know that there is such a rich history, a Japanese history in Florida. So yeah, if you would like to give that perspective.
Yes, it really hasn't been talked about. We are trying to make it more known to the United States. But anyway, it was so far away from Japan. I think that's why the West Coast was so much easier. They came and it was there. This was very far away. It is a lot of sand. It is a very different agriculture than they were used to. And it did only last about 20 some years. And yet we have Yamata Road, which is a large road here in our area. We have quite an influence as the Morikami Museum and Japanese Gardens in various ways. And as I said, I find that almost to be a miracle. But I have to almost say, from the Japanese perspective, that it is an interesting and wonderful culture that many people are interested in today. And I think this is a great time for us to educate more, because we do have their attention, to be perfectly honest, with the anime, the manga, et cetera, even though some of them are violent. But yeah, that's what we're trying to do at the Morikami, is look into different things that people would be interested in, to see where the connections are between the Japanese and the Americans, and see what they might be inspired by. So yeah, it is interesting what's happened here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Diane. Mitzi or Lynn, would you like to field, or we can move on to another question?
Really,
yeah, absolutely.
I just also, yeah, thanks, Diane. I also want to just make a comment on the statehood issue. So,
yeah.
There are many actually in Hawaii who don't think statehood was such a great development. Right. And so I just want to acknowledge that that there are folks in Hawaii who don't necessarily ascribe to the sense that statehood, open doors for everyone from a political standpoint.
Right.
I want to respect all of those differing point of views. In terms of, if I'm understanding your question, I think something unique that the Nisei Sansei, the Japanese population in Hawaii, brings to overall American society is a connection to Japan. And so that's why I feel very thankful that the Sasakawa Foundation is supporting events like this, because Hawaii and Japan have very, very close ties. And my particular organization is really trying to see how we can develop bringing those two, Hawaii and Japan, closer together. We recently participated in an event where some of the descendants of Japanese soldiers who participated in the bombing of Pearl Harbor came to visit Hawaii. And I believe they also went to DC, the East Coast, Diane and Mitzi. And they came to Hawaii in particular to visit Pearl Harbor, but they were very afraid to come because they didn't know what kind of welcome they would receive, since the war was not that long ago, actually. But myself and another officer from my organization said, by all means, we're invited. We're honored to be invited. So we met with these individuals from Japan. We didn't speak each other's language. I just know English, and they only knew Japanese. We did have an interpreter, but it was one of the most moving experiences I had ever had in my life. That, you had descendants from two countries who were at war some 80 years ago. And what this was a moment where we could express a welcome to each other, and that what we have in common is a desire for peace. And so I think in kind of a unique way, that's what some of the Japanese, the Nisei Sansei can kind of bring to the table in a global sense. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. Yeah, that kind of viewing Japanese Americans as a bridge to,
right,
reconciliation between something horrible that happened.
Right.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Right. Obama had come to Hawaii, not too long ago, and met with Prime Minister Abe. Wow. That was a monumental move, and not to be soggy about this, but I think events like this can really help to bridge gaps, not only between people but between countries in small ways.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Lynn. Mitzi, anything towards that, or we can move on? I see we have a few questions in the chat, and I do want to cover those as well. You good, Mitzi? Okay, great. So I'm going to actually now go to the chat because there are some really great questions there. Thank you to our attendees. So the first, and I think this was on my list as well, from Paul: how can we start teaching children in American schools about, America's history, its sometimes dark past, and also how can we elevate stories like the Nisei veterans and just contributions from Japanese Americans in the US? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's absolutely critical to do that. And we and other organizations here in Hawaii, other local Nisei veteran organizations, have really been trying to make an attempt to integrate into the public school system and the private school system. As you can imagine, it's a bureaucracy that you've got to be able to maneuver within and into. But we're working very hard to try to institutionalize some teaching within that system, but to do so in ways that can really resonate with the students. I think we can all remember being in school, and if you have a teacher teaching a subject that he or she doesn't have the tools to teach or doesn't have an interest to teach, it's not going to make a difference. And so the teaching module is going to sit on the shelf somewhere. So we're really trying to not just provide content, but provide content in a way that can resonate with the young people. Easier said than done.
Absolutely. Education in a nutshell.
It's got to be done.
Yeah.
It's got to be done. Yeah.
One of the things I mentioned about the JET, if I could just say quickly, is that if I understand correctly, many teachers came out of the JET program that are now teaching in the United States.
Correct.
And
Yes.
this, I think, is a great step in that they're listening to Mitzi and Lynn and myself. And hopefully they can think of interesting ways to present our words to some child or young adult. And that's what I'm hoping for, is they realize that this needs to be incorporated by hearing our words. So
absolutely.
And we should get on school boards and fight for curriculum changes in an institutional top-down way, because a lot of these teachers are so swamped. They're trying to, cater to tests. And so it's hard for them, even if they have the desire to actually have the time to put these units in. And I know some teachers, I have friends who are teachers who do that, but they squeeze it in oftentimes.
Yeah.
But so, and you're right, I agree, Lynn, sometimes if the teacher is not comfortable or well-versed in history themselves, they could do more of a disservice. They could do more danger by teaching it incorrectly. So it does have to be really thoughtfully planned out. And not, I think too often in elementary and middle school, even high school, students are introduced to Japan in a very kind of thingified way, like the people, place, and thing. Okay, let's try on a kimono and here eat sushi. And okay, we're done with Japan. It's so bracketed and so corny. It's like, oh, it kills me. So, there's no meaning behind, like the history of discrimination is totally avoided. People are very scared to really go there. And so, but we have to, right? I mean, other countries, when they've had atrocities to people of their own, their own members of their society, Germany, like they've gone through such an incredible re-education program for, to kind of root out those sentiments. And we really have to embrace that, I think. And so, like I said, kind of going and standing up to people saying, we can't teach this. This is, we don't want to. It makes me uncomfortable. It makes, of course, it's uncomfortable history. You have to be ready to embrace it. So I think if we keep pushing that, we will get somewhere.
And I would add to that, it's not just our educational system. There are many ways to reach young people. You could go to YMCAs. You could go to a church. You can go to very non-traditional teaching sites and just give a 10-minute presentation using a video. You could take students when COVID lifts to these various historic sites in Hawaii. There's so many that represent the Nisei Soldier story. You could actually take students to these various places. You could deploy programs where the student does the teaching themselves. So, for example, one of the things we're doing is we're working with a reporter, and we have put a call out for high school students to learn about journalism using the Nisei Soldier story. So we've got 5 students from public schools. She's teaching them about journalism, and the end product is going to be some essay on a Nisei soldier that who they've interviewed.
Wow.
So, there are ways you can teach by having the student do the teaching themselves. So many different ways you can do this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's probably the conversation that we need to be having at this point in time, especially as we've seen, unfortunately, cases of completely omitting history. I mean, I can maybe think of one class that covered Japan, and it was within the context of, opening borders and in 1865, and beyond that, there was really nothing that spoke towards Japan, and then later on, Japanese Americans' contributions to the U.S. So I appreciate all of your comments. And let me see, we have a few others. All right, and then so this one is directed towards Mitzi from Amber, but it's open to any of the panelists. Did you find anywhere in your research about Nisei vets and Black World War II vets coordinating or sharing information about how to gain their due and or full acknowledgement from the government? And that's a really good point. I kind of wanted to touch on this as well, as the collaboration between soldiers, like did the Nisei have any contact with Black American troops during World War II? Was there any sort of solidarity between those two marginalized groups?
I can speak more to what happened in Japan. Maybe Lynn, maybe you have research on the collaboration after they returned. I mean, I know that there were activists, Japanese American activists like Yuri Kochiyama, is that her name? Yes, who was very active with Black activists, kind of fighting for more equality and fighting structural racism. And she was kind of trying to really directly talk to Japanese Americans here about Black American issues. But yeah, and I could tell you more about what happened in Okinawa between us, but maybe Lynn, I don't know if you have.
Yeah, during the war, I don't know for sure, but during the war, I don't think there was much collaboration because the units were segregated.
Right, exactly.
And so there was simply not much opportunity to to interact. Post-war, I would say not so much in Hawaii, although I think that's changing. I think it should change, but I'm sure on the mainland, maybe Diane can speak to that more than I can. I think there is more of a sense of collaboration among different groups to push to kind of move forward on a civil rights agenda. Although, I think many people don't know that when Hawaii became a state in '59 and they had their first territorial legislative session, Martin Luther King actually came and addressed the legislature. And, I'm learning as I do this. And he made some remarks about looking to Hawaii as kind of for lessons that the country can absorb about racial harmony and racial justice. And I had no idea he had actually come to Hawaii to speak on that. But to answer your question, I don't know.
No, and that's something that I think is an avenue for anyone who's interested, who's attending, who's interested. That's something to explore in an educational setting. That's something that you can take further in your question and research into this topic as well. So wonderful. And Diane, if you have any perspectives about, the mainland in regards to that, or.
This is a very important time. I agree with Mitzi. Japanese Americans, and I'm just obviously generalizing, wanted to move forward and did not want to look back. And in fact, my friend Henry Kamiya, who you saw their little home, it was his grandfather that built that. I asked him, did you talk with your grandfather about the Yamato colony? Do you remember things that were Japanese? And he went, no, we wanted to be Americans. We didn't want to talk about it. We didn't want to talk about the war. We just wanted to. And, I kept thinking to myself, I felt the same way. And yet I couldn't get away from it. Hello. So I think it's really time for us to kind of come to grips with all of this, to look at it and say, I look like this. I'm an American. I have my rights. You have your rights. You look like what you look like. And I just think it's an interesting time right now for that. And Mitzi, if you want to say some more on that, because you are obviously
our Okinawan expert.
Got this, yeah.
About just
I guess
realization of our pain and I know that was in the West Coast, and I hear this from so many of my friends who were or parents who had parents who were in the camps, and they said, my parents didn't want to talk about any of this. And I think this is common to any kind of traumatized group. A lot of people, there's this real wonderful book called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. So she's the one who just wrote Caste. And she was talking about how she would interview people who left the Deep South, the Black American families, and they didn't want to talk to their children about why they were leaving, like all the pain of lynching, and they just, to utter this again is to relive it. And so, it gets embodied in visceral ways. And so I think for any kind of trauma, Japanese Americans, Muslims who, were being attacked after 9/11, any of these groups who are marginalized and vulnerable will kind of find safety in silence. And, and that's a traumatic response, right?
Yeah.
So I think sometimes we give communities time to heal. And we see this in Okinawa, in my mother's home. She's a war survivor, right? And she didn't like to talk about the war until much later. So many of her friends and family died. And now when you come as a community, you find a way to collectively talk about, you have the tools, right? You have a language to enter the conversation where you feel safe enough to talk about these things. And I think that's where we should be kind of heading, is to find a safe, and I know that happens in Hawaii because there's a larger community, and in the West Coast, I've seen that. It's harder here, I think, in areas like in Florida, right?
Yeah.
There's so few of people who would resonate with, they're not ready to receive the stories. And so the protection is still like to just hold on to them, right? So I think that's what's, we're seeing. It's so uneven, the ways that people heal across the country, depending on the kind of, the prefectural associations that exist are not here like they are on the West Coast,
Right.
So I think, we're going to see different responses in different parts of the country.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. And then we only have a few minutes left. We have one more question that it might be an easy one, but it's Craig Allen asks, why do you think that the 442nd Regimental Combat Team became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history? What about this unit made them stand out from other units? And we kind of touched on it, we did touch on it in your presentation, Lynn, but is there anything outside of what you have already said that you think resonates to that question?
So, and I would say the 100th 442nd.
100, yeah.
Yeah. I think because you had a unified culture. And so the men who were in these units came from a single culture. Now, of course, not every people were individuals, but they had a common cultural identity. And they had a common set of cultural values that everybody understood. And so cultural values like gambari. Gambari means perseverance. Gaman, quiet endurance. Haji, you never want to bring shame to your family, to your country. So these men from the mainland, the men from Hawaii, they were raised in a singular culture, and they could move as one. They knew what each other, what the soldier next to them was thinking. And so I think from a military perspective, that is incredibly valuable when you have a unit that can fight as one, because they all understand each other. So I think the cultural values and the cultural identity laid the groundwork for the 100th and the 442nd to emerge with that kind of reputation. Now, the MIS, while there was an MIS program, these MIS soldiers were not a unit per se. They were individual soldiers were embedded in different units. And so unlike the 100th 442nd, there was probably less of a sense of unit cohesion, if you understand what I'm saying. So yeah, I think the 100th 442nd, they trained together, they all trained together. Those from Hawaii, many of them knew each other. So their historical pinnings and then their cultural identity, I think, made a difference.
Great. Diane, did you also want to comment on that, or?
No, I thought that was well done.
Yeah. And I wonder as well if, another famed, I'm not sure if it's a regimental combat team, but that, the one I think of is Tuskegee Airmen, which it was also a unified unit of Black Americans that were fighting. And if that kind of cohesion and not like the solidarity within that group played a role in their ability to be recognized as a successful combat unit during World War II, much after the fact, unfortunately, rather than during their time. All right, and I think that's all the time we have this evening. I want to thank everyone, all of our panelists, Lynn, Diane, Mitzi, so much for joining us today in Hawaii, this evening in Florida and around the US. I'm so thankful for the conversation that we got to have about the legacy of Nisei soldiers and veterans and what that means for us going forward. I think there's a lot for us to take away from this conversation, and hopefully this can be a jumping off point for our audience members, for us as researchers, as board members, as educators as well, to research more about our American past, to include Japanese contributions, Japanese American contributions, like the Nisei soldiers, and recognize where we can improve upon our current historical understanding of marginalized groups within the US, and understand why we came to that conclusion in the first place. And hopefully with that, we can kind of move past some of the unfortunate incidents of anti-Asian hate that we've been seeing recently. I also want to thank our supporters and contributors, Bahia from US JETAA, and Isabel and Shanti Shoji from Sasakawa, USA. Again, this webinar would not have happened without you all, and I'm so thankful for your support in making this conversation available to people all around the US. And then Mike, I see that your hand is up. Did you also want to say a few words? Oh, maybe. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much, Erin. Let me put this back on. No, Erin, I thought you did an outstanding job leading and moderating. Thank you very much. I did mention to our distinguished guest that I've been sick for about 10 days or so. And Erin, again, thank you very much. I thought you did an outstanding job. Alan from the Florida chapter, Danae from the Florida chapter, thank you also. I think we had a wonderful turnout. I'd like to also recognize Representative Ken Ito. I appreciate, Ken was my mentor when I was did some work with the Veterans Military International Affairs Committee for the state of Hawaii. So Ken, thank you for being there. I thought this was a great talk. Talk one looked at a lot more of the soldier legacy than this talk. I think did a great job connecting a lot of the dots with the so what and now what. So again, Lynn, Mitzi, Diane, thank you very much. And Erin, thank you very much. And to our audience, thank you very much. And Erin, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, that's it from us. Thank you for joining. And we look forward to reading through your chat and getting your survey results from after the webinar. Thank you all for joining. And then panelists, I will go ahead and send you a separate link as everyone, a separate Zoom link so that we can chat after the meeting. So I'll go ahead and end the webinar now as I see our participants list dwindling.